This is Almonte in 2012. Beautiful, isn't it? But that's a story for another time. Now, let your imagination soar and join us on a journey back in time.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way.
Farther back. Think the previous century. No, further than that. But we'll come back to her shortly. You're getting warmer, but not yet. Haha, very funny. Not that far. Now you're talking. Ludwig was still alive in the year that we're heading for, and though he was a little long in the tooth for a rock star, he was still creating beautiful music. You got it. It's 1821, the year that Napoleon checked out while living in exile on the island of St. Helena. This fellow would eventually have some town named after him. In 1821, he was 18 years old. This future queen was just 2 years old. We're beside a river that was known by at least a couple of names, one of which was Mississippi, which means Great River. Aside from water and wilderness, there's nothing here. If you waited around long enough, you might see some First Nation people carrying canoes and other materials along the portage trail that runs beside these beautiful falls. These falls are destined to play a big role in this area because, thanks to them, there was power to run water wheels. This source of power brought several entrepreneurs to the area. They built lumber yards and mills, lots of mills. And because there were mills, people were needed to work in them. And these people need places to live. They also needed churches and schools, hospitals, and doctors were needed to care for the well-being of the town's citizens. The railroad was brought in to carry people and goods to and from the town. All of this required administrative services. The mills were rife with fire hazards, as were many of the homes. People worked long and hard, so sources of entertainment and relaxation were needed. We could go on, but to make a long story short, many other resources, including stores, hotels, restaurants, blacksmiths, and so on, all became part of the interwoven fabric of the town. This is the story of how all this and more came about. This is the story of Almonte's interwoven past. In the very beginning, the settlement that would eventually become Almonte was known simply as the place on the river with the falls. Among the very first settlers were David Shepherd and Daniel Shipman, both Americans, and James Wiley from Scotland.
So the first settlers started to show up here approximately 1820. They would have had to have come from Europe through Quebec, Montreal, down to Prescott, up to Perth. Perth was a garrison town, garrisoned by the British Army. And the British Army ran this depot where people were registered, picked a lot, and they were given a certain number of tools and said, okay, off you go.
The basic grant was to David Shepherd on the proviso that he build a sawmill and grist mill to serve the settlers of the area. And the grant gave him 200 acres, which included the entire river section and area around it. So this is very valuable in the whole town of Almonte. Now, he didn't have much money, and he built the sawmill, and I've never been able to find out whether the sawmill burned down or whether he just sold it or he went bankrupt. But what he did was borrow money using the grant as a collateral. When he ran out of money again, he sold the whole thing to a man by the name of Boyce, who bought it for his son-in-law, Daniel Shipman. Shepherd had borrowed the money from Wiley. And Wiley didn't do anything about it right then. He let them finish the sawmill, build the grist mill, and then he tried to foreclose. And it was a big battle took place. Today, he could have had the right to just take it all over. But the Upper Canada Council declined to have him take it back. As a result, Boyce and Shipman made out newspaper ads and checked everything, and they worked for several years, and they finally found Shepherd in New England. Made a deal with him, gave him the money, he paid off Wiley, and then Upper Canada Council then transferred the deed to Shipman.
So things got off to an interesting start. Wiley's land grant included 200 acres of riverfront property in the area along current-day Malcolm Street. He established a dairy, a dry goods store, and a Scotch whiskey distillery. Along with Shipman and Wiley, 3 other notable early inhabitants were John Gemmell, John Menzies, and John Haskins. Gemmell, originally from Scotland, was granted 200 acres in what is now the southern part of Almonte. He christened this the Homestead and built a shanty on high ground where he could look out over the bay which local settlers began to call Gemmell's Bay. He opened a store, and the first church services were held in his barn. Some years later, he built a large 2-story stone home with a very steep roof. When Gemmell died, his partner John Menzies continued the business and moved it to his home by the river. Gemmell's son would later donate part of the homestead to the Reformed Presbyterian or Cameronian Church. And much later, Gemmell's granddaughter, Winifred, left some of the remaining property to the town to be used for recreational purposes and the remainder to be divided into lots for housing. The area is now known as Gemmell Park. John Haskins, the slide master, had a sawmill by the bay and built 2 water sluices to carry logs from the upper river over the falls and down to the mill. One slide was where the train bridge would eventually run. The second, longer one, ran beside where the Victoria woolen mill would later stand. To this point, most of the settlers came from Scotland. In 1823, Peter Robinson led a group of settlers from Ireland to the area. Many of them settled in the northeastern end, which became known as Irish Town. Civilization was beginning to creep into the area. 1826 saw the appearance of the first public school, and a library was approved at a community meeting. In 1828, a wooden frame bridge was built just upstream of the current bridge by the town hall. Part of it is visible at the right edge of this photo of Shipman's sawmill. Finally, it was no longer necessary to ford the river. In 1835, Daniel Shipman built a stone house at the top of Mill Street. When first built, it faced the river, so he could keep an eye on his sawmill. But this would later be changed when the railroad came to town. The hotel in the back was added some years later. The original house is the oldest surviving building in town. In 1840, James Wiley replaced his log house with a beautiful new Georgian-style mansion that he called Old Burnside. This mansion also housed the first post office in the area, which served the township of Ramsey. Daniel Shipman had promised a parcel of his land on Bridge Street to the first established church to set up in the area. Much to the chagrin of the devout Methodist, it turned out to be the Catholic Church. But Shipman was good to his word, and graciously, though possibly a bit reluctantly, gave the land to Father John Hugh McDonough to build St. Mary's Mission Church in 1842. Daniel Galbraith, another lumber baron and lawyer, built this magnificent house. His mill was located near the present-day fairgrounds, and it is said that he would go up to the Widow's Walk to watch for the boats coming into the mill with loads of timber.
Near as I can figure out from the registry office, the building was built in 1854 by Daniel Galbraith. And the mortgage that was taken out on the building was for $5,000.
The house, which is currently Gamble's funeral home, has some interesting features.
And this fireplace behind us is an interesting old thing, and as much as the lion's head that you see straight up at the top, it actually is removable. So it comes out, and there's a safe in behind the lion's head, so it actually comes out of the wall.
In a little over 30 years, the community had really been established, but it didn't have a proper name. By the mid-1850s, various parts of the community were going by different names, and it was time to settle on one.
So they got together and they called it Waterford. Waterford for two reasons. One, that Peter Robinson, who brought a lot of the Irish settlers here, came from County Cork, in which Waterford was in Ireland. And secondly, by the front bridge by the old town hall, when the water got very low in the summertime, you could get water about that deep. You could ford the Mississippi River. So they settled on the word Waterford and sent it off to the post office. Now, the post office wrote back to the consternation of all the populace and said, sorry, but somebody else has already got that name. Well, I can imagine people's chagrin when they found that out. There were a number of people suggested the word Almonte. Now, Almonte was one, Almonte is the proper pronunciation of the word, with the Spanish equivalent of the accent aigu on the end of the E. He was the Mexican ambassador to the United States, starting in 1851, I think it was. So we're talking 1853 now. He was still the ambassador to the United States, but getting ready to be the Mexican ambassador to the French court in Versailles. He ended up as a general in the Mexican army, but became quite a career diplomat. And around 1853, the Americans bought a huge chunk of the southern United States, which is southern United States now, from Mexico for $10 million. But there were a lot of hard feelings between the Americans and the Mexicans at the time, with a bias on the American side towards the Mexicans, but Almonte stood up for the Mexican people. There was quite a bit of anti-American feelings in this country too at the time. So people admired Almonte for his stance in sticking up for the Mexican people. So there was admiration for what he was doing, and I would imagine anybody would say, well, after the disaster of Waterford, nobody's going to pick Almonte, so this is probably a good name to pick. On the motion of Mr. Toshik, seconded by Mr. Smith, the 33rd rule of council was suspended and the bylaw was read a third time and passed. Council adjourned for the period noon hour until 2 in the afternoon, June the 21st, 1855. That's the date the town picked to name Almonte.
In 1857, James Rosamond, or as he's known in family lore, James I, arrived in Almonte along with his wife Margaret and their 5 children, William, Bennett, James, Marianne, and Rosalind. From that point until the early 1950s, the names Rosamond and Almonte were truly interwoven. But the story of the Rosamonds goes further back.
James Robb was born in 1805, and they're Protestants in a Catholic area. And apparently a group of youths thought it would be a great fun to burn down the Rosamond house. Now, one of the Rosamonds, and I was told it was Edward, Edward shot one of the people coming at him, and 3 brothers left Ireland. And they came to this area, and then they went to Watertown, New York. Why? Or Ogdensburg, one of those areas, I'm not sure which, and went into the booze business. They obviously saw an opportunity, but they made enough money to come back and settle in Carleton Place. I think they were about the 7th family to go in there, and they bought up everything. So they must have made a lot of money selling booze in New York. And they certainly had a woolen business there because they had them divided up. They had a fulling business. That was a shrinking of the wool after it had been woven by the housewife. Then there's the washing and cleaning. They did that, and they carded it, so they had a carding mill. They carded it, gave it back to the woman who spun it, gave it back to them. They used the fulling process to shrink it to make it windproof. And then eventually they formed a woolen company that did the whole process in Carleton Place. There was an ad taken out in the paper that said Rosamond and Bell will no longer accept chicken, pigs, etc. for work. They demand cash of the realm, which obviously there was an awful lot of barter going on in those days.
James Rosamond started his business in Carleton Place because there were falls, Morphy's Falls at the time, which were, I think, 20 or 21 feet drop. You get your power by the amount of water that goes over a large drop. So the same amount of water going over Carleton Place versus 60 feet in Almonte, typically it would mean you'd have 3 times the amount of power available in Almonte than you would in Carleton Place. So Rosamond, wanting to grow his business, figured that he had to move to Almonte because there was more power there in the days before there was electricity.
The woolen business actually began in Almonte in 1851. The Ramsey Woolen Cloth Manufacturing Company was jointly owned by a group of prominent Almonte and Carleton Place citizens, including Daniel Shipman. Their operation was in a building that stood just uphill of the current Victoria Woolen Mill. James Rosamond had a minor ownership in the business, so obviously he already had his eye on Almonte. After the wooden structure burned in 1852, James bought the site, including the water rights. He would later build a stone mill on the site, where he would begin his Almonte operations in 1857. After 5 years, James stepped back from the business to concentrate on his new fascination with the railways. His sons Bennett and William leased the mill and organized a new firm called B&W Rosamond Company. They had a third partner, George Stevens, a Montreal financier. The Rosamonds' relationship with Stevens had played a significant role in bringing the railroad to town. The original Victoria woolen mill building was joined in 1863 by the five-sided building that still stands, though it looked considerably different than it does today. It was originally 3 stories and had a different roof design. Their business prospered, and they soon needed more room. In 1866, Bennett, William, and James Jr. began construction on a massive building that would become a landmark in the town. By 1871, a newly formed Rosamond Woolen Company was operating with Bennett as president and managing director. The new facility was the largest woolen mill in Canada at the time. The Rosamond No. 1, as it was known, employed 74 men, 105 women, and 30 youths. It produced $350,000 worth of tweed annually.
And of course, the Rosamond Woolen Mill didn't make just any woolens. They made worsted, the best, longest thread, all that kind of stuff. Where others failed, they succeeded because they sold to a high-end market.
The Rosamonds expected a full day's work from their employees, but they were very fair, and in spite of how this looks to us today, they paid higher wages than the rest of the industry at the time. Thanks to the success of the Rosamond Woolen Company and the many other mills and support businesses that joined them, Almonte would enjoy full employment for the next 50 years. William preferred to stay in the background, but Bennett would prove to be a brilliant businessman. He also had a successful political career and served Almonte successively as councillor, reeve, and mayor. He then represented Lanark North in the House of Commons from 1891 until 1904.
His personality was such that when he was running for Parliament, he failed several times. He got his brother to do it for him. And his brother was a charmer. That was James, my great-grandfather. And my mother just adored this man. And he was a lovely person. And he did all the things for Bennett, so for a run for Parliament. They liked James so much they elected Bennett.
While Bennett enjoyed tremendous successes, his life was also touched with tragedy, as all 3 of his children died before he did. When Bennett passed away in 1910, James Jr.'s son Alexander George, who had been groomed to take over the business, became president and managing director. While on business in England in 1914, and at the relatively advanced age of 43, Alexander enlisted as a private in the British Army. Shortly afterwards, he transferred to the newly formed Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, where he served as a lieutenant. Alexander fought for 2 years and was killed in the Battle of the Somme at Courcelette, France in 1916.
I know he was offered a desk job back in London, and he refused it to serve on the front line.
Over the decades, the Rosamonds exhibited significant generosity to the town of Almonte. One such example was the cenotaph that is so familiar to everyone. In his will, Alexander bequeathed funds to finance a memorial to represent the men of Almonte who fell for freedom.
Our grandmother had said, Mary, Rosamond had said, that she had asked Tate Mackenzie, because they all knew each other. Tate Mackenzie was a great pal of my grandfather's, to not to make it look like Alec. Alec had left the money when he went overseas, and she had asked him not to make it look like Alec, and when they unveiled it, there he was.
Well, we're looking at probably the last photograph ever taken of Alex Rosamond, your grandfather. And do you think that the statue of the volunteer at the cenotaph in Almonte is modeled directly after him?
Alex Rosamond's photograph was used by Tate Mackenzie to create the sculpture but it was Granny Rosamond who wanted to remove all the
regimental insignia from his epaulets. And also, I think that the story is that he had, the sculptor, Tate Mackenzie, actually just used his thumb in the wet clay to remove the cap badge, because it actually showed a Marguerite daisy, which is the insignia of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
Yeah.
Other examples of the Rosamond generosity included a significant donation by James Sr. for the completion of St. Paul's Anglican Church, a leading role in the building of Almonte's first hospital, the Cottage Hospital, and an outright donation of the Rosamond Memorial Hospital. While Alexander was away during the war, his younger brother Archibald Greenfield Rosamond, known as Archie, was called back from New York, where he had been pursuing a career in the theater, to take over as acting managing director.
I liked him very much because he was nice. He used to sit me on his knee and you know, but that's all I know of him. And I don't know a whole lot about his, you know, his failed aspirations. But I do know that he had to take over the mill, and I guess he wasn't very keen on it.
As synthetic fabrics came into existence, the woolen industry went into serious decline. The Rosamond Woolen Company, which was already struggling under Archie's leadership, was hard hit.
My father took over the presidency of the mill, Ewart Stavert, after Archie died, because somebody had to look after it, and I think he took it on in order to sell it as well as he could for the family.
After 95 years, the Rosamond era in Almonte had come to an end.
But the most consistent thing I think I've found in reading all of the stuff about the Rosamonds is that nobody said anything nasty about them. Nobody said an unkind word.
Arguably, the coming of the Rosamond family to Almonte was one of the most significant things that happened to the town. It wouldn't have been what it was, nor what it is this very day, without their involvement.
But what I remember mostly were the bells that called people to work, the bells that signified lunch. And Almonte was a cacophony of sound because the main street had, I don't know how many mills were on it when I was a kid. There were a few anyway, and they had whistles and bells and all sorts of things. So at certain times you could hear them all blowing.
This was a mill town, and at one time it was called Little Manchester because most of the workers in the mill came from England to work in the woolen mills. There were so many mills in Almonte that, if you lost your job in one mill, you just went across the road and you got another job.
Over the decades, literally dozens of mills came and went, some through failure, some through takeovers, and more than a few by fire. There were sawmills, grist mills, carding mills, knitting mills, shoddy mills, foundries, planing mills, a soap factory, several dairies, distilleries, cabinet and chair factories, door factories, boat building, a pump factory, and of course woolen mills.
My dad worked in the Rosamond Woolen Mill as a weaver, and he was able to get me a summertime job for 2 summers when I was about 10 years old. And my job was to carry the bobbins from the stockroom to the various looms so that they would never run out of bobbins. I had to be very careful, of course, because each loom required different colors of bobbins, so I had to make sure that I had the right bobbin going to the right loom. Now, my dad, when I was there, they had automatic looms. They had about 72 to 75 looms, and they had a row of looms and faced another row. So my dad looked after six automatic looms, and 3 on each row, face to face. And as far as I know, my dad was the only one in the weaving room that never stopped the looms to change the shuttles. He caught the shuttles on the fly. Everybody else turned the loom off, changed the shuttle, and started the loom over again, which was something to see because those shuttles flew back and forth at a tremendous speed, and of course with all kinds of noise, tremendous noise in the loom. If I had to say something to Dad or one of the weavers, I had to get up beside their ear and basically yell in their ear to say what I wanted to say.
I remember my dad telling me, and he wasn't very old, but he started working at Thoburn's mill, and he went in more as an apprentice, and he learned how to spin at Thoburn's mill. And he was working in Thoburn's mill for the grand sum of 10 cents an hour. He worked there for more than a year at that price. And he thought, well, I know the job well enough, I think I should get a little bit of a raise. So he went to the office at Thoburn's, and he said, and he went to the secretary there, and he said, Miss Anderson, I would like to speak to Mr. Thoburn if it's at all possible. And she said, well, just take a seat out here, Jimmy, and I'll have him I'll tell him you're here. So she come out and she says, yes, he's not busy, he'll see you right now. So my dad went in and confronted Mr. Thoburn, and Bill said, Jimmy, sit down on the seat opposite me. And he said, we can talk. And he said, what was your problem, Jimmy? And he said, well, I've worked as a spinner for more than a year, and I was getting 10 cents an hour. And Mr. Thoburn says, yes, that's quite right. But what is your problem? He said, well, I learned the job well enough that I think I should get a bit of a raise. So Mr. Thoburn said, well, Jim, what do you think you'd like for a raise? Well, my dad said, I think I'd be entitled to 12 cents an hour. Bill Thoburn got up off his chair, and he went over and touched my dad on the shoulder, and he said, Jimmy, you come around and take my seat. I'm going out and do your job.
This works was installed around 1920 here because Mr. Thoburn across the street here ran a mill, and he decided that he wanted a clock on this building so that people of town going to work at the mill would know what time it was and what time to leave. So anyway, he had this overlooked tower, a clock tower, designed and installed around 1920.
All this activity needed buildings to house it. Almonte looked very different in days gone by. Most of these buildings are long gone, and only a handful remain today, and even they have gone through changes. So we're sitting in the Heirloom restaurant on the ground floor of the Victoria Woolen Mill. The building itself has a really fascinating history. One of the first things that we did when we bought it in 1993 was to start digging up that history and trying to find out what was here and what was the original state of the building, and because it had been empty for about 3 years or so roughly when we bought it. And so we turned up a lot of very interesting old photographs and old documents. This is the second of the 2 Rosamond mills that were on this site, and where our upper parking lot is now, was where Rosamond Mill number 1 was. So that was the first building that was built, and we have a photograph from 1858. That photograph shows the original mill, number 1, and there's a very large, long timber slide running along from the upper falls to the lower falls, and that timber slide runs right through what would be the restaurant where we're sitting now. And so we know that in 1858 this building didn't exist, but we know that in 1863 this building was constructed. And it was built as a 3-story stone structure with a lower level as well, so a total of 4 stories. It's kind of like a split level. There's an upper parking lot, a lower parking lot, upper entrance and a lower entrance. And it was joined to the original Rosamond number 1 mill by a 3rd floor bridge that went between the 2 buildings. So we know this building was built in 1863. We know that it was 3 stories at the time. And then we have other photos. We have a drawing of the building that is in the 1872 Lanark Historical Atlas. When we went to renovate in about 1994, we knew from that drawing that there was a lower level set of windows facing the upper parking lot. And over the years, the street had been built up and the ground had been built up and had completely buried those. So we were able to excavate a window well and put those 3 windows on that side of the building back again. But in 1879, we see the 2 buildings together, and the Victoria Woolen Mill is now a 6-story structure. So we know that the top 2 floors were added sometime between that first drawing in 1872 and the drawing that was done in 1879. So somewhere in the mid-1870s, which is really not that long after the building was built, within 10 or 15 years, there was a 2-story addition. And one of the peculiar and interesting things about this building is that the top 2 floors are in a different color stone from the rest of the building.
Yeah, my grandfather, A.C. Gilmore, he was Alan Gilmore. He was a general contractor. It was always full of lint because they were cutting up and carding and tearing apart all second-hand wool clothes. And it used to catch fire quite frequently. And one time it caught fire fairly seriously, and they didn't get it out. And when they decided to rebuild after the fire, they decided to put a couple of more stories on it. So if you look at that building, you'll see a certain color of stone up, and then from the top 2 stories is a different color stone. That's the portion that my grandfather put on there.
Other features of the building are that the walls are thicker on the lower levels, so which is natural with stone. You start wider and then it gets narrow as you go up, so that the top floors are larger in square footage area than the lower floors, even though it's on the same footprint. We know that, of course, it was stone and timber. There are a lot of large timber posts and beams in the building. There are different floor heights, which is kind of peculiar. In fact, the level above us where we're sitting, the mezzanine gallery, is only 8 feet. And once closed in and finished is actually just about 7.5 feet in height, whereas some of the other floors are 11 feet. Or 11 feet 4 inches. So that's one of the kind of peculiar things about the building as well.
When you look at the community itself, you had things like the ironworks came to fruition. That, as far as I know, was in part owned by the Rosamond family as well. So they started developing other things within the community to help their organization be able to survive. And all these things driven from the textile industry. So you had anything from blacksmith shops, flour mills. There were so many things that developed based on this basic need in the community. And the amount of people employed was just unreal in such a small community. That majority of the community were involved, either working directly in the mills or somehow involved indirectly, whether they had a shop on Mill Street where the mill workers all shopped and the president of the mill shopped. So you have all of these things that kind of counteract or work off of each other.
Almonte's early history as a mill town resulted in an interesting social situation in that there were the very well-to-do mill owners and the working class. There was little in the way of middle class. This becomes evident as you look at the older homes around the town. There were the beautiful mansions of the mill owners that contrasted with the homes of the mill workers. Old buildings, many built of wood, with oil-soaked floors and beams, the air full of lint, dust, and static electricity. Was it any wonder that the fires were commonplace in the mills? Homes didn't fare much better. Most were wooden, and in the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, wood and coal were the dominant heating sources. In 1906, the western side of Lower Mill Street was completely destroyed by fire. It was September 21st, 1906 at 4:20 a.m. when the alarm went out. Fire had started in some buildings behind Scott's Furniture Store. While no one was hurt, the fire did destroy the area from the commercial hotel down to West's store, the site of the present-day Heritage Court Mall. Several homes on nearby Farm Street were also destroyed. The greatest fear was that the fire would spread up Mill Street, but with the help of 20 firefighters who came from Carleton Place on a special train, the fire was brought under control.
The first talk about an organized fire department was in 1871. In 1873, first mention of buying a piece of apparatus that they could use as a pump, i.e. a hand pump, or perhaps a hit-and-miss engine. It really doesn't say in the history that I've researched what it would be. In 1873 again, they decided to put out a tender for a new fire hall that was to be located somewhere around where the railway station yards were. In 1875, being a little bit more modern, they put out another tender for a hook and ladder cart or some kind of a vehicle that they could pull to a scene along with the hand cart, which would have ladders, pike poles, that type of thing to help promote fire service in the town. In 1884, the first steam-driven fire engine came to Almonte. We all have seen the pictures where they're horse-drawn. Almonte's first steam engine was to be pulled by the strong men of Almonte, which was kind of an interesting history. Firemen are supposed to be tough, and apparently the town elders believed that, so they ordered their first fire engine in steam-driven to be pulled by the healthy men of Almonte. At that same time, they ordered a hose cart which would hold 500 feet of hose, which would be unrolled at a fire scene from a hydrant. Fire department of Almonte still own that piece of equipment, and it's on scene outside the fire hall in Almonte. A nice piece of Almonte history that I found in one of my antique escapades was the original fire proposal for Almonte's first steam fire engine in 1884. I believe the price was $2,850 in New York City currency, which was American money, of course, on or before September 10th, 1884, and $50 in cash to pay expenses of a man to deliver engine and instruct an engineer. Another piece of interesting history is there's a picture of the steam engine and firefighters from Almonte after they've came back from a major call in Carleton Place, where there was a fire in Carleton Place. They stopped the train as it was going through Almonte, loaded the steam engine on there, and whisked it merrily away to Carleton Place with the firefighters actually on the train car and on the flatbed itself. Very interesting piece of history. In 1938, As part of the Almonte flour mills burning, they had to call the Carleton Place to bring their fire equipment over to put the fire out. At that point in time, they then ordered a new motorized fire truck, which would be Almonte's first fire engine, motorized, and is still in the fire hall today, which has been lovingly restored by the members of the Almonte Fire Department. This would be the very best in firefighting equipment circa 1880s, 90s, and the early teens. Would consist of a fireman's lantern, which you could carry in, a trumpet nozzle, a nice leather hat, and a nice leather jacket. I'm ready to fight my fire, except I don't have my handkerchief in my mouth. Okay, again, we're moving a little bit more forward in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s. This was our gear, which consisted of hip boots, a longer coat, a composite helmet, and even a visor to protect your eyes. Again, even a little bit more modern into the 80s, a little bit stronger helmet. We've gotten into, again, the visor, and of course, Almonte Ramsey Fire Department written on the back. Modern day equipment, as in 2012, integrated mask, man-down alarms, composite bottles, 45 minutes of air on my back. At any time I can go into a burning building and be quite confident that I'm going to be safe, and in case of you, I can drag you out of your house or home.
From the mid-19th and on into the early 20th century, medical practice and the life of doctors were very different than they are today. While Dr. William Mostyn was not the first doctor in town, he was certainly the most colorful. Born in Ireland and educated in Kingston, he set up a practice on Lower Mill Street in 1858. He would later build a home on the corner of Queen and Clyde Streets that would subsequently be occupied by several other doctors and become known as the Doctor's House. He was never married and was a member of the Anti-Connubial Club, which celebrated the benefits of bachelorhood. However, his taste for women was well known, and it was rumored that he fathered several children in Almonte. He was very involved in both political and social aspects of the town, and can be seen in this picture at the laying of the cornerstone of St. Paul's Church. He couldn't swim, and was nervous when on the water. On a cold, windy day in March in 1881, he was determined to check on a patient in Appleton. The roads were impassable, so he was forced to go by boat. On the way back, he and J.W. Manning, Jr., the young man rowing the boat, drowned. A few years later, Dr. John Frederick Hanley set up a practice in his home on Bridge Street.
I'm Linda Hanley Reed, and I am the great-granddaughter of Dr. John Frederick Hanley, who was doctor here in Almonte from 1892 to 1927. The doctor's day was very busy. He would have office hours from his house, where his office was, 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and the evening ones went till 9 p.m., and in between those times, there would be hospital rounds once the hospitals were built, rounds to the patients' homes, deliveries whenever babies arrived, morning, noon, and night. And it made for a long and no doubt tiring day.
This poignant letter, read by his great-granddaughter, describes what life was like for a small-town doctor.
Dear Bruce, your letter to hand today, and although it was welcome, I can scarcely say that I was particularly glad to get this one. For one thing, I am very hard up and in pain always. I have nearly sweated blood to save $1. My means, alongside of yours and our other brother SC, is almost pitiful. My personal clothing is almost a disgrace to me. Jenny is not much better. Bruce, our youngest, has not yet had a single dud of new clothes on his back. My fur coat, an absolute necessity here in winter for driving, is so shabby that I only wear it at night. My insurance is less than $4,000 today, and I have to pay more than twice what I did at first. I've never joined a curling club or a golf club since I came to Almonte. I was not able to afford it. Jenny's mother has stayed many years with us. I would gladly have earned it all, but Father wished to take some trips and begged me to get through my schooling as soon as I could. Not many in Midland get through college before they're 22 years old, but I did, and from that day to now I've been at work. And up till now, my holidays in the past 30 years have in all amounted to 6 weeks. Since I've been in Almonte, I've not averaged $1,500 a year. This is the Christmas season, but Christmas gifts and I will be very much missing here this year. But I hope you will all have a happy Christmas and a prosperous and happy New Year. Your loving brother, and he signed it J.N.O. F. Hanley. It was, although his name was John Frederick, abbreviations for their signatures, I gather, was common, and his was quite unusual, and he always signed it J.N.O. F. Hanley.
Another memorable doctor, and the face in the middle of this mural, was Dr. Archibald Albert Metcalf. He arrived in Almonte in 1897 and practiced medicine here for 65 years until his death in 1962 at age 92. He was very involved in the town and served a term as mayor. He loved sports and was a patron of many local teams.
He delivered both of my children, Jane and Peter, and quite often during my wife's pregnancies, he would call at the house to see how everyone was. And I was working in the woolen mill at the time, and after let's say the first child was born, I stopped in at his office. I'd got my pay from the mill, and I stopped in at his office to pay him for his services. And I don't know how many calls he'd made during the pregnancy, but he got the book out to look and tell me, and he said, and all he'd done was, whew, he said, "Boy, it's pretty high." He said, "Did you want to pay some of it, or did you want to pay it all?" And I said, "Well, how much is it?" He says, "It's $27. And I said, "Well, I think I can afford to pay it." So I paid the whole thing. One of his greatest loves was his hackney horses. He used to always show a horse at the Almonte Fair in a little very small buggy, you know, and all fancied up with the fancy harness and everything. And he used to keep his horse in behind the office, but he had a place down at the foot of Bay Hill, which is now called Metcalf Park. He donated that to the town. And that's where he used to practice going around with his hackney horses. And he was a great believer in the Almonte public utilities. That was his pet project. And I remember he often said, you know, they built that plant in the wrong place. He said they should have built it down at the foot of the falls. In other words, probably where the present plant is now situated, because you get more water power than you would up where it was.
The face in the upper right in the mural is Dr. John King Kelly, who lived and had his medical practice at 77 Little Bridge Street during the first half of the 20th century. He suffered with rheumatoid arthritis, which left him with a permanent disability.
Dr. Kelly, he was our doctor, and I had pneumonia a couple of times, and quite often about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, he would come to the house because I was sick. And he never did charge much that I know of. He was pretty reasonable, but he never refused to come at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, which you can't find anyone doing that today.
He was an avid supporter of the library, and his daughter Elizabeth would serve as the town librarian for 37 years. The third face in the mural is Dr. John Francis Dunn.
So in 1911, my grandfather came here and bought the house, the furnishings, complete with an upstairs maid, a downstairs maid, and a cook for $3,000 in 1911. He met my grandmother shortly after, and they married and had 13 children. Now, my father told me a number of stories, and this is fairly typical. He had a horse named Frank he kept out back, and my father said a number of times he would be awakened in the middle of the night, hitch up Frank, get the buffalo robes and the hot bricks, and they'd be gone for 3 or 4 days at a time going up country to deliver a baby. And there'd be no payment made of any money, but come harvest time there'd be sacks of potatoes or carrots or vegetables. I don't think they ever had meat, but be laid at the doorstep, and the accounts would be taken that way. Now, my grandfather was obviously brought up with horse and buggy, and people graduated to cars fairly quickly with no instruction at all. He was a terrible driver. He never had any instruction at all, and one day he was driving down Country Street to come down the hill, and the car stalled halfway across the railroad track, and the train came through and sliced it in half. Luckily, he survived, but it was a couple of days later before my grandmother said, "Where's the car?" I've got a story to tell you. The other story about my grandfather is he had a young man, I think he was about 12 or 13 years old, out near Corkery, who was dying of diabetes. And he'd heard of the work that Banting and Best had been doing in Toronto. So he phoned the laboratory, got somebody on the phone, I don't know who, told them the sad story that the boy was close to death, and could he get some insulin? So they said yes, and they put it on the train, the afternoon train, and he got it up here, and they had said it had only been given to 2 people up to that time, but my grandfather said, "This boy is dying, what's he got to lose?" So they put it on the train, and he gave it to the boy, and the boy lived.
From 1859 until the middle of the 20th century, the railway played an important role in Almonte. However, it wasn't initially intended to come through town.
The railroad is never supposed to have come to Almonte. If you look at the map, and you're building bridges through swamp-infested territory from Brockville up through to Pembroke, the last thing you wanted to do is build a bridge, because they were incredibly expensive, typically made of large timbers or some stone. So the question is, why did the railroad show up in Almonte where they had to build 2 bridges, and then they were forced to build another 2 bridges in Pakenham, when they could have gone down the 8th line and no bridges at all?
The answer is Bennett Rosamond. He worked his political and financial connections with people like George Stephen, who was both a banker and a director of the Canadian Pacific Railway, to ensure that the railroad would come to Almonte to serve his mills.
It was the Brockville and Ottawa Railroad that went from Brockville to Almonte 1859, and it stopped at the train station. And then, a few years later, it went across the bridge and on to Arnprior.
For roughly the next 90 years, the railroad would service the town well.
Very busy. The railroad was certainly busy, busy, busy. There was no two ways about it. They were coming and going both ways. That siding was well used.
You used to get a few cents more per hundredweight of your milk if you shipped it to Sudbury up to the north before the days of the Milk Marketing Board. So at midnight we'd have to take our 2 cans of milk and the truck out to the station, and you got the big lantern inside the station, and you ran out on the tracks and waved the lantern, and the huge train stopped for your 2 cans of milk. And that's where the term milk run came from, because it went all that way up to Sudbury. Yes.
When farmers shipped cattle by train, and not everyone had a truck or whatever to transport them. In some cases, they'd just drive them down the street. There'd be a number of people with a good dog or two, and just to keep them from going up side streets or whatnot, they drove them right to the railway depot and loaded them there and whatnot. You certainly don't see that anymore.
Well, I can remember, again, there would be 4 or 5 guys, and we always had to watch when the train was coming through if there was a message for the guy, because the person that was Demi Miller at that time, that was looking after the station, he was the station agent, and they'd race out with this long thing. It looked like a snowshoe, only it was a long thing with a hoop, and he'd have to run and make sure that the engineer got this. The engineer would only slow down to about 40 mile an hour, so he had to make sure he'd get this hoop, and that'd be the message to do something, because they didn't have radios then. So I can remember that, and I can remember the train coming in, stopping, and there'd be 10 cars, there'd be maybe 40 people would get off of the train, and a whole group would get back on. I remember my sister, she went to Tabor Business College in Carleton Place, and they commuted by the train. It was 20 cents a day. They'd go over to Carleton Place, and return ticket was 20 cents, and they would come back, and they would do their school in Carleton Place and then come back. And when the train would stop, they would back in these long, funny wagons, and put all the parcels on it. Then the parcels would go to Bill Stewart. He had an old open box truck at the back, and they hand delivered those parcels all around town wherever they went to. You didn't go and have to pick it up. They'd deliver it right to the house.
There was a tragic event in the history of the railway in Almonte. It happened on December 27, 1942. Lorne Richardson was enjoying his first run as engineer of a passenger train as he sat at the throttle of Canadian Pacific's Passenger Extra 2802 East. As he was approaching Almonte, he was aware that another train, CP 550, also known as the Pembroke Local, was supposedly running 20 minutes ahead of him. It was what he didn't know that was about to result in horrific consequences.
I believe in miracles, and one of them took place that night when the conductor persuaded us to go into the third coach from the rear, which was destroyed, and stay there. Our plan was to obey him, but head to the back of the train once we get inside. But something told us, stay where you are. You know, this is fine. It's only a short ride.
My father was a private by this time. This was December 27th, 1942. So he'd come home for Christmas and was joined by my great aunt So they were heading back to Ottawa. Now the train had come in late into the station, and typically the front of the train was full, so that what they did is they went to the back of the train, got on the last car, it was full. They got on the second last car, it was full. Got on the third last car, it was full too, and they just got into the fourth last car, and the troop train came in and smashed into it and destroyed the last 3 cars and killed, what was it, 36 or 37 people.
So when we got hit, we didn't know what had happened to us. It was like an explosion. The train had just started to move very slowly when the whole window in the station that I was opposite to literally exploded. And we found out later that was a body that went through that window from our coach in onto the floor of the station. Mentally, it has never left me. I can still see when they brought the lanterns in later, there was a lady that was sitting in what was a seat across from the arm of the chair I was sitting on that was dead. And she had hundreds of pieces of the coach wooden slivers in her. I remember that as they carried us out. And what was left of the roof of our coach, there was a young lady who had a steel rod or something right through, and she was pinned to the roof of what was left of the coach. Of course, she was dead. We were in the coach and trapped in it for about, I guess, 3.5 to 4 hours. It couldn't get to us. The problem being that there was so much wreckage, we found out after, that you could only go to the town hall on one side with us and to the O'Brien Theatre on the other side. You couldn't work back and forth. I remember some of the story going around that the owner of the O'Brien or manager or whatever didn't want to let anybody in there and use it as a morgue or whatever was necessary. That's what they were doing with the town hall. Anyway, I think they knocked the hinges off the doors and went in. That's a story I've heard.
So we come down, and when we got down to the War Memorial, you could see the track where the troop train had gone into the passenger train. And in those days, they were wooden coaches. They weren't metal coaches like they were later. And it was just like a pile of toothpicks, a humongous big pile of lumber, all shattered there, where the engine had gone right into the back end of the passenger train, and it was a god-awful mess. They found a baby down in the trees around the War Memorial the next day, and like it had been thrown out there and survived. Yeah, it was in good. Was just fine, and that was quite a ways.
Darn right.
The one saving factor that was a big factor is the guys on the troop train were going overseas, and they had medical supplies with them. Mm-hmm. Which made a huge difference.
And they put people in the theater and the town hall.
That's right. Oh yeah, any place they could put a stretcher, they put somebody. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the troop train was equipped with stretchers and first aid equipment and all this kind of stuff, which was a big factor in the long run. Yeah. Or they probably would have lost a lot more than what they did.
At least twice a year, I'll go to Almonte and stand on the track at the little metal and little steel overpass that's there near the town hall, and look down the track to the famous curve and picture again what Mr. Richardson saw when he came around that curve. That's all that slowed him down, was to come around the curve. Now, he couldn't see us because we were 2 cars apparently across the road, and the crew of our train did not put out flares. Apparently our taillights were next to not very good, and there was vapor rising off the waterfall there that goes through Almonte, which hindered his view of seeing us. The only indication that there was something ahead, and apparently the green light was on the roof of the station, giving him a clearance, I understand. I know it was on in Pakenham, that caused the whole thing as far as I'm concerned. because the railroad should have known that this special was coming behind us that wasn't there yesterday or last week. And the green light was on in Pakenham. Station was closed, as it routinely does, apparently. I don't know, but anyway, what he saw with this headlight reflected off the rear door of the rear coach of our train, the glass door. Well, there wasn't a chance in the world of him being able to stop that train.
Almonte of the late 19th and early 20th century was a dynamic, self-contained community. People lived here, worked here, shopped here, and played here. Wooden sidewalks were common, but there was no truth to the tale that they were rolled up at night. Initially, no streets were paved. Mill Street wasn't paved until the 30s.
Dad was the town engineer. He had the main roller himself. He was involved and he got a lot of things paved. Would never get paved except because of his effort.
Communication is a part of everyday life. In the shipman era, there were two forms of communication: word of mouth and the Ramsey Post Office, located in Old Burnside. Later in the 19th century came the telegraph, and towards the end of the century, that newfangled thing called the telephone.
464W or 109J, so you knew it was a party line. And many times the operators, if you were to call a certain person and there was no answer, then the operator just had to come on and say, if you're looking for Mary Smith, just to pick a name, she's over at so-and-so's house. So you could read the operator, if you wanted, they could redirect the call for you.
Well, firstly, we had a two-party line with a rotary phone on the wall. You couldn't take it with you. It was stuck there. I don't recall the number. Of course, every morning people went to the post office to get the mail, and you met your neighbors and friends at the post office. And the same as on the Saturday night, all the farmers met their neighbors, and the townspeople met their folks too, because everybody went to shop a Saturday night.
Maybe the farmers used to all come in on Saturday night.
Oh yeah, and they'd stand out in the street in front of the stores and talk until 5 minutes to 10, and then they'd come in.
Then they'd go into the stores.
Changes in technology also meant a dying out of various types of businesses. In the days before refrigerators, there were the ice boxes.
We had an ice house on Wesley Street in Almonte. It was run by a gentleman called Mac Montgomery, and they called him Freezer Montgomery because he kept ice in there all summer for delivery to people in town. They cut the ice up above the Galvin sawmill at the end of Water Street, big blocks, and they cut it and covered it with sawdust so it wouldn't melt away in the summer.
I can just barely remember the horses, and he'd have a blanket on the sleigh and then blocks of ice and then another blanket on top of the sleigh, and they would go around town and drop a block of ice at whatever customers.
In later years, there was the cold storage.
Where Vamos is now. The old West hardware store. My father, well, 2 stories. My father told me that as a child he would go in there and they would have 2 stories. They had their stuff for sale downstairs, and they had this little trolley. You paid for it, so they put the money in the trolley. The trolley went upstairs to the lady who made change and sent the trolley downstairs. The clerks weren't allowed to touch the money. Well, when I was a kid, that whole ground floor was part of the IGA, and it was a walk-in freezer. The whole inside was a walk-in freezer. So this was in the days not long after the Second World War where home freezers were not very readily available. So what you would do is you'd rent a box, which would be 3.5 feet wide by 18, 20 inches tall by about 2 feet deep. It was wooden slats with a little clasp and a lock. So as the family grew, my mother would have have 1, 2, or 3 of these. They wouldn't necessarily be side by side. They'd be one up here, 1, 2 rows over there, and 1 over there. She would send me down with a list, get 2 roasts of this, something of this, something of this, something of this. Well, something would be here, and the other something would be over there, and this is the middle of August, and I'm freezing like crazy. Get out of there as fast as I can and get a cold.
They had, when it was built on like what they called a mud sill. They put the big logs down right on the ground, and then they built on that. But these were getting rotten, and Dad and Grandpa had to jack the building up and get in underneath there and take those old logs out and put in a stone foundation underneath. And they found like there was Almonte is on stone, as you know. They just hollowed out the center of the basement, and then they had a lower, like the basement floor was like this, and then down, and then everything was down in there. But they used to store stuff up on this stone shelf, and they crawled back in there to get at these log, or mud sills as they call them, to take them out after they got the building jacked up. And Dad found an old 100-pound, the round cheese, 100 pounds, and about that high and about that size round. And it was all covered with green mold and stuff like that. And Mr. West said, throw it out, Harry. God, it's horrible. So Dad took it home, and he cut about that much off of it all, but inside it was about 100 old cheese, and we ate cheese for a while.
There was 3 blacksmith shops in Almonte. There was my dad's and grandfather's, and Dick Hickey was down on Water Street, it was right behind where the Canadian Cafe is now, and at the just across before you come to the powerhouse at the end of the bridge. My grandfather used to fix wagon wheels, etc. And there used to be a large furnace at the back of the blacksmith shop where they'd put the steel rims in, and then he'd rebuild the wheels with new spokes or whatever, and then you'd place it on the wheel, the rim on the wheel, pour water on it to shrink it, but it was warmer sitting there than it would be sitting at the front closer to where the horses were being shod. And of course Dad didn't want too many people around where he's been doing the shoeing, because if a horse acted up and when the horse gets excited, or they kind of run blind, and they'd run over you rather than around you.
At the foot of Mill Street, and you cross the bridge, a building was built there, and it was called the Nickelodeon, our first movie. Of course, these were no talkies, and you've seen what they did in those days. Later, Peterson's ice cream plant, on the 2nd floor, he has had a fairly good-sized floor, and it was a dance hall, party place. Also, they showed movies there.
The building that houses the hub was originally the Orpheum Theatre, which later became the O'Brien Theatre.
Another thing would be the afternoon movies at the O'Brien Theatre. And of course, it'd come out in the bright sunlight. And something you may remember also would be the midnight movies, which were rather popular. We're always excited to get to that. And to try to get into the show, you had to be, the late show, was it? You had to be 13 or 15, and you get, unless accompanied by an adult, and you were stopping the adults on the outside to ask them if they would, here's the money, would you take me into the show? And then, of course, you'd leave them right away.
Like today, Almonte was blessed with many talented musicians. One of the favorites was Charlie Finner.
They'd start at 8 o'clock at night and play till 2 in the morning. And they played 6 and 7 nights a week when he was going full tilt, all the way up and down Quebec side and the Ontario side. He certainly got to know the Ottawa Valley and hundreds of people. One of his highlights was when he called off for Don Messer, who was on the TV and the radio, and he really enjoyed that. And
a favorite annual event was the Almonte Fair.
And they used to have the fair in different places, like up on Union Street. There was an area where they had a racetrack behind the Methodist, what used to be the Methodist Church. And they had an area out on Boyd Jemison's farm too. But in 1862 they purchased 3 acres where the fair is presently held, and they added some more on in the 1960s. The amounts that people had to bring for produce, and that was what was most noticeable. You had to bring a bushel of beans or a bushel of potatoes. Nowadays we ask for 5 specimens. And of course they had all kinds of sewing and crafts and that kind of gems, and baking in the hall too. But and sometimes they had classes for the best plow or that kind of thing, the machinery as it came on board. When you talk about entertainment, I think the thing that was most, well, that I remember was when Don Messer came to the hall, and that was in the late 1940s, and Howard Giles was the secretary. He'd been secretary of the fair for decades. And his son Harold, who's my brother-in-law, he told me his father said, when you're having somebody like Don Messer come, we have such a poor floor, we have to put a new floor in when Don Messer's coming. So they put in the hardwood floor that's there now. And there were so many people came, they said 20,000. I find that hard to believe, but that's the figure. 20,000 paid $1, and so the cost of the floor was covered that night. Good investment.
Restaurants were an important part of daily life. The most enduring has been the Superior.
I'm Dave Scott, and my father and my uncle were the owners of the Superior Restaurant for 17 years and 7 months. I believe they purchased it in about 1948. It was more of a soda fountain type of store at the time, where they would, of course, make milkshakes and sodas, and of course Peterson ice cream. One of the nicest, one of the things I enjoyed the most was they roasted their own peanuts, and then when it was hot, it'd be laid out on a slab of marble, and they would salt it, and it was just fabulous. I would go down the street with my mother on a Saturday night, because at that time in Almonte, the early 50s, Saturday night was the night that all the stores were open and shopping, and it was always a busy night at the Superior. And along with fair nights, also with the O'Brien Theatre, which someone else may make reference to, would let the audience out about 11 o'clock. So they would stay. They wouldn't close till after 11 o'clock until the people of the O'Brien Theatre came and had their coffee, etc.
It was right after the war. In 45, they opened the first one, and then as the mills were booming at that time, and they expanded. It went to the next store down, and then Beaton's took over the other and built a jewelry store in there, and then it was, they had a little contest. I can't remember the year, but they had a contest. They decided that they would make a new name for the restaurant. And they had a little competition, and I really don't know who's came up with it, but they called it the Mill Restaurant. So then, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, the woolen mills got less and less work and that sort of thing. And then he closed that one and then moved to the next store. And then the next one had maybe 3 tables and maybe 6 or 8 stools in it.
By the mid-1950s, most of the mills were gone, the world was changing, and Almonte was undergoing a radical change of its own.
When the mills dried up, as they say, Almonte lost 3/4 of its support and life, employment, abilities. You had to work, depend on just individual outlets like our little dealership and stuff like that, where you had 6 or 8 or 10 people, whereas before you had 30 and 40 on the list. It was a hurting time for a lot of people. You've got to hustle along and get something done before the town dies out, you know. But we didn't, we kept Almonte alive.
It's undeniable that the first 130 years of Almonte's history were exciting, action-packed, and in many ways unique among small towns.
It was a nice town to grow up in, very friendly place. And in the morning they opened the door and threw us out, and we came back at night. Nobody worried about us, nobody knew what we were up to, thank God, but we had a marvelous childhood.
People were really interested in the town. They were really interested in any group activity. People turned out just one after the other. That was all the 40s, 50s, 60s. Yeah, that was, I suppose, a good time. Maybe the golden years, who knows?
It was a great place to be proud of. It is a great place to be proud of.